The east coast of the contiguous United States features a prominent north-south trending notch. And on a map, it's easy enough to overlook this geographical oddity. But a closer inspection reveals that Chesapeake Bay is one of the most significant bodies of water anywhere in the nation and perhaps the world. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Fitz, the resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Explore.org hosts 3 webcams of wildlife in the Chesapeake region currently. One cam watches over an osprey nest in the Upper Bay. A second looks at a great blue heron nest on the Delmarva Peninsula. And a third cam observes a family of peregrine falcons nesting in downtown Baltimore. These cams showcase different species with different habitat needs, yet they are all tied to humanity's relationship with the bay and surrounding landscape. In just a moment, we'll dive into the effort to restore, protect, and ensure a healthy future for the Chesapeake Bay with the Chesapeake Conservancy. But before we do that, I want to take a little time to address a recent great horned owl attack on the great blue heron nest that we watch on Explore.org. And that's the nest that I mentioned just a moment ago on the Delmarva Peninsula. So about 10:30 p.m. on May 22, a great horned owl attacked the nest. 2 of the 3 chicks died, and a third fell from the nest or was displaced from it. When I reviewed the footage, I couldn't see how the third chick fell out of the nest, but it ended up doing so. And that chick was found on the ground alive below the nest by the property owner and is now being cared for at a wildlife rehab center. Our partners at the Chesapeake Conservancy reported it was stable as of this morning, and we hope that it has a speedy recovery so it can be released into the wild once it's healthy enough and mature enough to do so. Great horned owls, they are skilled predators whose diet consists mostly of mammals. Yet birds are also a significant food source for them, and nestlings of large birds like herons are most certainly on the menu. When we watch webcams of wildlife, nature's harsh realities are often on display, and this is an example of that. Other examples include brown bears skinning fish alive as they eat them, and lions tackling and toying with zebra foals before finally making the kill. And of course, we see owls, we see hawks, falcons, eagles ambush their targets on the cameras. It's not unusual to become emotionally invested in the success of animals we see on the cams. We want a bear cub, for example, to grow up healthy. We want young birds to experience the freedom of leaving the nest for the first time. There are plenty of other examples too. So if you found the loss of the heron chicks difficult, if you had been watching that cameras throughout the spring, then that's okay. And I think it's understandable to feel that way. People are emotional creatures after all. And as much as I try to invoke my inner Spock when I watch wildlife, I often feel visceral emotions when I see animals in pain or near the end of their lives. Reviewing footage of the great horned owl attack earlier today, the initial screams of the heron chicks were difficult to listen to. So if you found it, you had a similar reaction, it's okay to take a break from the cam if you need to. However, we should also avoid judging the owl's behavior in a negative. It was surviving in the only way it knows how. Much like an adult heron stalks a fish or a frog, we saw the owl's ability to take advantage of opportunity when prey was vulnerable. And I've said this before, and I think it's worth reiterating again, and I should definitely acknowledge that I kind of got this phrasing and this idea from Dr. Rob Beauregard, who works and has studied ospreys for several decades. And this idea is that nature is brutal, but it's not cruel because it does not act with malice. Predators hunt because they're hungry. That's simply the reason, that they're doing that. It's possible to feel empathy for prey at the same time, of course, and acknowledge and maybe even admire the skill and the cunning of the predator. Both of those things can be true at the same time. We recorded my conversation with the Chesapeake Conservancy before the great horned owl preyed on the heron chicks, which is why I had to address it now when we don't address it in the interview. We do talk, however, about heron rookeries, which are not common places, and how people can work together to protect nesting habitat for great blue herons, among other topics. As always, your questions and comments are welcome, so drop them in the chat. I'll be looking for them throughout the the program today, and I'll look to answer those questions toward the end of the broadcast. With that being said, to help us learn more about the Chesapeake Bay, its importance, and how we can protect it, including the wildlife that we see on some of our Explore.org cams, I spoke with Joel Dunne, President and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation and restoration of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Here's our conversation. Joel, thanks so much for joining me today, taking the time out of your day to talk about Chesapeake Bay.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I'm so grateful to Explore.org for hosting, paying for, and operating the cameras in the Chesapeake. It's been such an inspiration for everybody to see.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you and your organization along for the ride. And it's wonderful to watch those wildlife cams. And we're certainly going to get to questions about those in a little bit. But before we do so, I want to ask a question that maybe will help us understand a little bit more about the bay itself. Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States, but a lot of people might not know what an estuary is. So can you explain what is an estuary first, and maybe what makes the Chesapeake unique?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And that's a great question. So estuaries, very simply, are a body of water where fresh water from rivers mixes with the salt water from oceans. And that mixture creates a really rich environment for wildlife. And in the Chesapeake is not only America's largest estuary, but it's also the third largest estuary in the world. So it's this really just beautiful and magical place filled with not only wildlife, but important history and heritage. The Chesapeake has been crucial to the development of cultures for thousands of years, including our country as we know it, the birth of our country. It's really kind of the cradle of American democracy in a sense. But it also has amazing recreational opportunities because all these rivers feed the bay. And so there's all kinds of adventures to go on. The Chesapeake is a 64,000 square mile watershed. So it includes portions of 6 states and the District of Columbia. So New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, and Virginia. I don't know if I already said that one, but and it's pretty darn big, and that it's a very interesting dynamic because it's a 14-to-1 land to water ratio. So the water is the 1, the land is the 14. Okay, so importantly, we care about what's happening in the water, and we're concerned about fish and wildlife in the water. But we're also thinking about the land because what comes off the land goes into the water, and that affects the water quality and the personal experience of that water for health and welfare, but also for wildlife. So when you think of the Chesapeake Bay, think of that it's an estuary, but also think about the land that contributes to that estuary and to that water. Because it's all connected into this very complex and beautiful ecosystem. I really think it's one of the country's most beautiful ecosystems, rivaling some of the more notable places like Yosemite or Yellowstone. It's as grand as the Grand Tetons or as great as the Great Smokies. The Chesapeake is really an incredibly beautiful ecosystem and beautiful estuary.
It really is an amazing place if you have, the opportunity to spend some time there. And I haven't spent a whole lot of time there, but I've been fortunate enough to have some experiences in the Chesapeake region. Yeah, and it is really an amazing place. And like you mentioned, really important point that, what we do on the land, what we do at our homes and our businesses and through our commerce and everything else, that touches the Chesapeake Bay when you're in that watershed. And Explore.org and your organization, the Chesapeake Conservancy, partner on 3 wildlife cams. And each of those cams can help us consider the challenges experienced by wildlife in the Chesapeake region, as well as how people affect their lives. Let's start with osprey maybe first. This year, we've been watching Audrey, who's the female on the Kent Island nest, return to be courted by a new male partner. And a few studies that I have found showed that ospreys have fidelity toward their natal nesting area. And that is, they often establish their own nesting territory within 50 kilometers of the place they were hatched. So it's quite probable that Audrey's suitor is a local bird. It's also notable that this pair nests on an artificial structure. So they're not in a tree or anything like that. They're on an artificial structure. And Chesapeake Bay is a region wholly inhabited by people, as you mentioned. So how have the osprey in the area adapted, their habits and their nesting habits to adjust to an increased human presence, especially during the last 100 years?
Yeah, that's a cool question. So the osprey are probably one of our most signature kind of charismatic megafauna, if you will. Like lots of ecosystems have their signature animal, whether it's the pronghorn out west or what have you. But here it's the osprey. And the reason why they're so incredible is, first of all, they're super fun to watch. They fly around, they catch fish. 99% of their diet is composed of fish. So they're diving into the water and catching fish with their talons, and then they put it in between their talons so that the head is forward so they can fly more aerodynamically, and they bring it back to their nest. And then they rip it up and they feed it to their babies. But it's really, really a charismatic bird. And the interesting thing about it is it's a massive success story. So in the Chesapeake, we're constantly trying to restore, protect the ecosystem. We have big problems with pollution coming into the Chesapeake Bay in the form of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, which fuels these water quality problems in the Chesapeake. And for years, we've been battling this water quality issue, trying to decrease the pollution entering the bay, and because that affects fish and wildlife and ultimately birds. But every once in a while, you got to have like a really good success story to re-inspire people to care about the Chesapeake Bay and about the environment. And the osprey is that animal. And I'll tell you why. Because in the 50s, there was a chemical that was released in the environment here to kill insects, DDT. Many of you watching this are probably familiar with this story, but I've got to reiterate it because it's really important. So DDT was sprayed on farm fields and used for various purposes to kill insects. The problem was it wound up working its way up the food chain into the bodies of osprey and ultimately into their eggs, which made them too fragile to reproduce. The eggs would break, so the birds couldn't reproduce. So their population just crashed in the Chesapeake Bay. And so I know watermen who, when they were young, they didn't see an osprey anywhere in the Chesapeake Bay. But we banned DDT in the 70s, and over time, the osprey have come back, and now they are everywhere. I mean, there are ospreys nesting on bridges, on bridge signs, channel markers, buoys, and then we have platforms in the Chesapeake that people put out by their docks and stuff, and there's osprey nesting on those. So the osprey population they have about 10,000 breeding pairs in the Chesapeake. It's one of the world's largest, if not the largest, breeding osprey populations on Earth. So, and it makes sense. The Chesapeake is an incredibly productive ecosystem. It's nurturing a lot of fish. They eat fish, and so it's a wonderful sort of thing to be a part of and see the osprey come back, and watch them flourish. Now the challenge is they can't see it up close and personal. There's this cool reality thing happening with these birds. They're breeding, they're laying eggs, the eggs are, flying around, or the birds are hatching from the eggs, and they're learning how to fly. And it's really, really fascinating, but it's hard to see up close, right? You're driving your car by or your boat by, you see it for a split second. The thing about the cam is you can watch the whole thing, from them building the nest to reacquainting after being apart for a whole season, laying their eggs, and then having them hatch or not. It doesn't always work out. This is nature. This is reality. So we lose a lot of birds too. But anyways, it's a charismatic animal, and it is a signature animal for the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah, and that statistic that you cited, well, talking to watermen, first of all, that when they were younger didn't see osprey, and now having 10,000 breeding pairs in the area, I mean, that's kind of a remarkable story overall. Of course, having healthy populations of animals also means making sure that we're protecting the lands and the waters for them. So, with such a high density of birds, can you talk a little bit about what efforts are in place to ensure, or maybe even expand, protections for ospreys on both land and the water?
Sure. Ospreys are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is an important federal federal legislation. But also, just protecting land and water in the Chesapeake is important for ensuring they have the habitat they need in order to survive. So let's say you protect a piece of land upstream from a small river feeding the bay. How does that help an osprey? Well, that piece of land may filter water running off from a farm that was carrying nutrients and sediment. And it, by protecting the piece of land and preserving the trees along the river, it keeps that water clean, which allows the fish to breed and flourish, which, the osprey need in order to survive and feed their young. So there's this interconnectedness between land conservation, land restoration, and water quality and habitat for osprey. In addition, people have been pretty generous about putting up nesting poles and platforms for the birds because, well, it's cool, right? You get to see them more often if you have a platform you can reliably see. But it also encourages people to think through, okay, what do these birds need in order to live and survive? And I can talk to people about land conservation and habitat preservation who are inspired by the birds. So it's a sort of interconnectedness between laws, actions on the ground, and inspiration of the public to care.
You mentioned too that they're protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and most of the osprey on the Atlantic coast, they travel to South America and to the West Indies during the winter. There's maybe a handful that, according to eBird records nowadays, that show that there's like a handful of birds that stick around the Chesapeake, but almost all of them are gone. They're definitely heading to warmer climes in the winter. And that includes Audrey and her new partner, who is nicknamed Tom. They live in the Chesapeake region for only half the year. So this question is maybe just a little bit broader than just osprey, but how do the habitats of the Chesapeake Bay factor into the overall success of breeding and migratory birds when you're thinking about like this migratory corridor down the east coast of North America?
Sure. It actually makes you think about how the rainforests of Central and South America and the estuary of the Chesapeake are connected, right? To have these birds summer up here in the Chesapeake Bay and then winter down in the rainforests of Central and South America, they actually split up from one another when they go down there too. So they sort of have a hiatus from their partnership, and then they oftentimes will meet back up.
Sometimes that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, interesting pattern. But yeah, so habitat protection in the Chesapeake is important, but so is habitat protection in Central and South America rainforests, which, as many of you know, that's like the cradle of biodiversity on the planet. And so we have to support conservation work around the world in order to continue to enjoy the species we find familiar. And it could be other migratory birds too. The warblers are flying through Maryland right now. My friend took a picture of 4 warblers this morning that he saw in his yard. So, but all of those nest in Central and South America too. They migrate to Central and South America in the winter and nest up here in the summer. So, there's this interconnectedness between global ecosystems that is vital for us to understand. And in order to keep the color of those beautiful birds and the magic of their flight, we have to protect these special places around the world for them to persist. I'm not sure if I got to your point. I think I was getting to your point, but
Well, yeah, sounds good to me. It is one of those places that is connected to the whole of maybe the Western Hemisphere by the birds and the wildlife that pass through that through the Chesapeake area. And we're also able to watch a great blue heron nest on explore.org. Great blue herons are, another story of decline and success in recent decades. They typically nest in colonies called rookeries, and if you're not familiar with that term, that's a place where many nests can be found in close proximity. And according to one source that I read, only about a dozen breeding colonies existed in the Chesapeake Bay region in the 1960s. But about a decade ago, in 2013, a survey found more than 400. Great blue herons are no longer threatened by plume hunting, and they've recovered really strongly from the DDT era. But their rookeries are places that are used from year to year, and they're sensitive habitats. They're vital to the success of the species. So, in what ways can like conservation groups or people who are just kind of concerned about protecting those sensitive places for great blue herons? How can you work with and partner with landowners and public land agencies to protect a sensitive spot like a heron rookery?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that. But first, I just want to say that if you've ever walked under or into a heron rookery before, it's sort of like going back into time, like with the dinosaurs. They're croaking. They make this loud, like deep croaking noise, and there's lots of them together making that noise. And so it's this, and they're big birds. I mean, heron are huge. And like when you get a whole bunch of them, 50 of them together, like I think there's about 50 at the site where we have the cam with you guys on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake in the heron rookery. It is wild. And that one, by the way, we had this guy climb 100 feet in a tree in order to get the camera to be in a good place. So it's a pretty unique view of a heron rookery. Usually you can experience the sound, but very rarely do you actually see it from that angle. So the cam is super cool. But so how do you protect a heron, right? How do you protect a heron rookery? First of all, you should alert people if there's one around, because it's important for biologists to know where they are. And they do move around. So a heron rookery can be one place for 10 years and then move, and then it can come back to that place. So it's important to report it to biologists. But the second thing is that private property owners who may have one of these rookeries on their land and want to protect it, they can use something called a conservation easement. An easement, a piece of land comes with lots of different rights: mineral rights, water rights, development rights, timber rights, all these things. And what you can do is you can work with a local conservation organization. Here, I'll just choose one: the Maryland Environmental Trust, which is a important land conservation institution. And you can donate a conservation easement on your property that eliminates the ability to cut down those trees or develop that portion of your property. And that preserves that habitat for the birds moving forward. There's other things you can do. We had a landowner who owned a heron rookery donate the entire piece of property to us at the Conservancy. And so there's different ways you can donate. You can actually sell a conservation easement to a conservation entity like the Maryland Environmental Trust or the Chesapeake Conservancy. So there's different ways that you can on a private piece of property where you can protect a rookery or a sensitive habitat in perpetuity. And it's an important thing to do because they're really beautiful and important parts of the ecosystem. And there's only so many rookeries. Like in the state of Maryland, I think there's as many as 20, maybe more rookeries. There's collections of nests. And we have seen a resurgence, which is really good, thanks to mindful landowners, a great natural resource agency in the state, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and some other measures that have helped the birds.
And the heron nest that we watch on Exploded.org is technically outside of the Chesapeake Bay's watershed, But as we've been talking about, ecosystems of wild animals, they don't exist in isolation. And great blue herons are there. We I guess associate them with water. We think of them as water birds, and they're particularly skilled at catching fish. Yet their diet also depends on local food availability. And some are skillful hunters of small animals in fields and grasslands. So when we consider the needs of great blue herons and other animals too, in sort of like the Chesapeake region, how does small stream restoration and the conservation of farmland help these birds and others find success?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. You're most used to seeing a heron sort of fishing, if you will, like walking around with those big legs, shooting its beak down and catching a little fish. But you're right, they do depend on land and hunting on land as well. So stream restoration is a key component of ecosystem restoration and protection. And it restores water quality, for one, and it allows for migratory fish, to breed and oftentimes travel up and down the streams. So it brings back fish populations that may have been destroyed by previous land use or pollution. And that's a big source for the birds. But I think also, conserving farmland so the birds have something to hunt on, and restoring streams by implementing best practices, smart practices of how to manage land and water runoff on a farm, are important to pollution reduction for the bay as a whole. So, and also I don't want to miss that farmland and the edges of a farm field, they are like really important rest stops and food sources for birds, migratory birds, not just herons or other birds, but migratory birds as well. So there's lots of reasons why conserving farmland and implementing best management practices on those farms are important to birds like a heron. So I think I covered that for you.
Yes, I think so. And there's one last cam species that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's the peregrine falcon cam in downtown Baltimore, Maryland. Peregrines are, in my mind, a symbol of urban wildness, if that makes sense. They're an example of wildlife finding home and success alongside hundreds of thousands of people. In the peregrine couple that we watch, who are nicknamed Bo and Barb, they nest on the 100 Light Street building in downtown Baltimore. And peregrines were nearly extinct in the eastern U.S. due to the effects of pesticides such as DDT in the mid 1900s. And this building, though, is sort of special in a way because it's hosted a peregrine since 1978, when a falcon nicknamed Scarlet was introduced to the area and took up residence there. How does and how can urban environments play a role in the conservation of species like peregrines and really the overall health of larger regions like Chesapeake Bay? I mean, we have Baltimore, there's Richmond, Virginia in the watershed, Washington, D.C., as you mentioned. So there's also these very large urban landscapes within the area.
Yeah, that's an incredible story of restoration. I mean, the peregrines were totally eliminated from the Chesapeake Bay. Totally. They were all gone. They brought this one bird out into the middle of Chesapeake, released it, and it wound up nesting on the Light Street building, which it had a different name then, but we call it just the address of the building now, 100 Light Street. And relatives of that first bird have been nesting there ever since. That was like the year after I was born, by the way. So they've been nesting there every year since I've been born. It's just an amazing story. And the thing is, like, there was an office right there on the edge looking at the birds. Now they've sort of put a dark window up so that not to bother the birds. They've been very conscious and careful of what the birds need in order to reproduce and not be bothered by the people working in the office behind the glass. But, those buildings, those skyscrapers really mimic natural habitats where you would find a peregrine, a cliffside. A peregrine would nest in a cliff in a purely natural setting. And they're amazing hunters. They hunt other birds primarily. And they're the fastest animal in the world. They've been clocked at up to 220 miles an hour. And what they do is they fly up and up and up and up, and then they dive bomb and they hit the bird with their feet. They knock it out, and then they take it from there. It is one of the most beautiful things to watch. I actually had a professor, an undergrad. His name was Dr. Steve Herman, and he used to fly peregrine falcons. It's an art. Some people train peregrines to hunt, and he took me out, and he took me out hunting, and he let his bird fly up into the sky, and he released a pheasant to that he wanted the bird to hunt. And his bird flew down 220 miles an hour, hit the pheasant, and my professor turned to him and he goes, "Now that's poetry." It was really, really beautiful. The peregrine falcon is an incredible, incredible animal. And what's interesting about these urban environments where they're found is it's actually providing a ton of food for them. The pigeons, sometimes they eat rodents, but the pigeons mainly provide them a food source all throughout the year. So they don't need to migrate anymore. And they're adapting to this urban environment. So it's really neat to be in downtown Baltimore, look up and see a formerly endangered species flying around, hunting other birds, and being able to see that success story up close and personal. Those birds, Barb and Bo, are named after, icons in Maryland. Barbara Mikulski, who was a U.S. senator, and Natty Bo, which was a beer that was brewed in downtown Baltimore. So it's a source of pride for people in Baltimore and Maryland to have the birds nesting in downtown Baltimore and to be able to see them. So now the cam lets you see them all year round, and they're funny. They lay their eggs right on these like little pile of rocks, and they're these bright red eggs, and when they hatch, they're these beautiful white like puff balls. And it's so much fun to watch them raise their young and then see them fly for the first time. And it's really great for people to be able to have a window into the world of the birds.
It's remarkable to see. And I checked out the camera today, and surrounding the chicks in the nest, there's just like piles of feathers everywhere. They're just remarkable hunters, and they're taking advantage of opportunity. They got that great nesting habitat way up high in the building, inaccessible to any threats to them. They got abundant food around them. So yeah, it's remarkable to see how they have been adapting to that circumstance and finding success there. There's a couple more questions that I do have for you, Joel, and these are questions that are about things that have been really kind of underlying much of what we've talked about so far. They're about the Conservancy's efforts regarding land and water and habitat conservation in the region. I have a special fondness, I should say, for salt marshes. When I am in an area with a salt marsh, I want to be in them. I want to get muddy. I want to see what's crawling around in there along with me. And the Chesapeake region has an extensive grass-dominated area of salt marsh. And they rank among the most productive habitats on the planet. They're vital homes for crabs and juvenile fish. And just in short, I guess, to be blunt, the loss of salt marshes due to rising sea levels would be a disaster. And the Chesapeake Conservancy, I read, is currently working on an effort to conserve 30% of lands in the watershed by 2030. How important is that effort in helping, habitats like salt marshes in the face of climate change? And how might that work to make our communities who are like in tidewater areas next to these salt marshes more resilient in the face of climate change?
Sure. Yeah. I appreciate your love of salt marshes. Ever since I was a little kid, I've loved to climb around in salt marshes too, and hunt for crabs and, fish, and just go on adventures. It's just a magical kind of ecosystem. So, so we're trying to protect 30% of the Chesapeake. Those wetlands, saltwater marshes, they're really, really important to the ecosystem. They, where that water meets the land is a very high biodiversity concentration throughout the ecosystem. Biodiversity meaning biological diversity, so different forms of life. And so protecting that area or being concerned about it in the face of sea level rise and storm surge is a critical concern. When you think about land conservation, in the old days, you used to think, oh, well, I'm going to protect this piece of land and then I'm done. It's protected forever. But now we realize that ecosystems and things need to move in light of climate change, whether it's temperature driven or sea level rise driven. We need to think about land conservation, and we need to use sort of the Iroquois mentality of thinking 7 generations ahead. Where do we need to preserve land today for 7 generations from now? And thinking about sea level rise and salt marshes and migration is very challenging because there's development coming one way. Everybody wants to live near the water, and everyone wants a house near the water, and there's all this human infrastructure near the water. But the sea level's rising, and those marshes need to move inland. They need to move to higher ground with time as the waters rise. And so we need to protect the habitat for the future where salt marshes are going to be, and we need to protect it today, right, where they are now. So it's a very challenging endeavor. When you have a wall or a house, it sort of stops the ability for these wetlands to migrate or grow, and we lose marshes and we lose the habitat that's essential for crabs and small fish and herons and all these other charismatic animals we've talked about. And we've seen this firsthand in our region. We're seeing significant impacts from sea level rise and storm surge, particularly on the eastern shore. There's large portions of Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge that are being inundated by rising waters, and the saltwater intrusion of these ecosystems is also having an impact on the trees that are growing along the shoreline. Big, devastating floods, sunny day flooding, disruptive tides, that's a reality here in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's something we need to plan around in an urban or a rural environment. In Annapolis here, they're literally raising the local park along the water by 7 feet to accommodate rising sea levels. And one of the best ways to deal with this phenomenon is to conserve wetlands surrounding these areas, preserve what's called green infrastructure, because it protects your main shoreline, it slows big flows of water or storm surge, and also, of course, protects the habitat for the animals living there. So it's really important to conserve those wetlands and those saltwater marshes while they're still there, and also to think ahead about where they need to move in the future. And so we're doing that in the Chesapeake, but we could always do better. One of the things we've been successful at here in the state of Maryland just 1 week ago, and it wasn't even a week ago, it was 2 days ago, I was at the state capitol with the governor and a whole bunch of other people celebrating a commitment by the state to protect 40% of the state by 2040, $400 million for program open space in the state, a new green space equity program, and a revised Forest Conservation Act in the state. So we are working really hard to achieve this 30 by 30 goal. We want that to be replicated in all those 6 states in the District of Columbia we talked about earlier, that are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have a long way to go. We need a lot of support to get there, but we are very much committed to protecting this ecosystem for current and future generations.
Well, what about the upland habitats? We've touched on it during the conversation as well, but when you talked about the land and the water ratio, and how it's whatever we do on the land affects the bay itself. So beyond salt marshes, beyond the tidewater areas, how does conserving upland habitats and engaging with communities really in the upper watershed or the far reaches of the watershed, like in West Virginia or like north central Pennsylvania, how does that factor into the protection of the bay?
Well, it's interesting. When people first started to try and save the bay 50 years ago, they were very focused on the bay proper, the actual estuary. And over time, they realized that that 14-to-1 land to water ratio was really important in protecting that or restoring that water body. And so they began to protect land throughout the watershed. Right now, they've protected about 23% of the landscape, which is pretty good. We're hammering away at the big picture. And part of that is protecting land way up at the headwaters, meaning where the watershed starts. That is where the water starts to flow that ultimately winds up in the Chesapeake Bay. Believe it or not, some studies indicate that 40% of nutrient and sediment pollution starts in the headwaters of the watershed. So, just solving our sewage systems or our farm runoff in the bay down close to the bay doesn't solve our problem. We have to think holistically from the very start of the watershed up in the mountains all the way down to the water. And so protecting land up there and implementing some restoration measures along those small creeks. Once, just a little work along one of those little creeks actually makes a big contribution to some of our goals in the Chesapeake Bay in terms of water quality and habitat. And the other thing is it makes the Chesapeake restoration movement tangible and local. So up in Pennsylvania right now, we have an initiative where we're trying to restore 57 streams. That sounds like a lot. It is. We have 60 partners. We've raised, I think, $24 million, and we have another 24 to go. But we are actually pinpointing places to implement stream restoration projects along all 57 of those streams to get it to the point where the water's clean enough to remove them from the impaired waters list. So it's a partnership effort. We are working from the very local scale of the individual partner on a subset of that landowner's land to a local partner, to a statewide partner, to a regional partner to try and restore these streams that ultimately contribute to the bay. And land conservation is a big part of that. If you're planting these trees, you want to make sure they're going to be there for as long as possible and forever, if that's possible. So the idea of restoring water quality, working with farmers and landowners to implement practices that treat the water, clean up the water, and create habitat, and how that eventually contributes to the water quality of the Chesapeake Bay and the estuary, which is where we started this conversation. It's really critically important. And to do that in a place that has 18 million people and has 64,000 square miles is incredibly complicated, and takes so many actors, from the Environmental Protection Agency to all the state agencies and the local nonprofits, the county governments, local governments, individual landowners. They're all working together. The Chesapeake Conservancy is just one small nonprofit in an ecosystem of thousands of organizations and agencies committed to these goals. One thing we are doing, though, is we are leading the charge to protect 30% of the watershed by 2030. We've made that our strategic goal as an institution. We have several signature projects, like with tribes and different groups across the Chesapeake to show how everybody has a role to play and how everybody has a right to enjoy the Chesapeake, and some people need to have those rights restored. So there's this real, I think it's an amazing movement that's happening here in the Chesapeake. And if we could do it in the Chesapeake, you could do it anywhere. 18 million people, 6 states, the District of Columbia, and all the challenges we have. I think it's a real hopeful sign for what we can do. Just like when we brought the osprey and the peregrine falcon and the heron back from the brink with DDT, I think we can do the same thing here with the ecosystem as a whole. If we leverage partnerships, technology, and we're really creative about using what limited resources we have, and we invest everybody in that movement, giving everybody the benefits of that restoration, access to the bay so they can enjoy it, but also giving them a sense of responsibility so that they donate to the bay, or they or they volunteer for the Bay, or maybe they commit their career to the Bay. I think what's happening here and the people who are evolving in the movement, I think are a hopeful sign for the future, and I think we could do it together.
Certainly, it sounds like a real world example of something that's working when you implement just small steps, like baby steps at a time. You do enough of those things, you eventually, you put enough steps together, you can walk across the continent, right? So you protect enough small streams, you can eventually protect an entire watershed. So yeah,
Yeah,
it sounds like an amazing effort overall. I do have one final question for you, though, Joel. I don't know if this will be the toughest one that I've asked so far, but this is when people ask me questions like this, it's always difficult for me to answer. But I'm wondering, what do you enjoy most about the Chesapeake region?
sure. I mean, there's so many things I love about this place. But the thing I love the most is sharing it with my two little girls. I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they're the future of this planet in my eyes. And I like sharing with them the beauties of the Chesapeake and how their eyes get big when they see a monarch butterfly fly across their face, or they watch an osprey catch a fish, or I tell them the story of the cultures that have existed here. Like I took my kids to this new park we helped create, Elktonia Cars Beach, and it celebrates Black history. And there's a picture of Ella Fitzgerald there. And my daughter was like, "Who's Ella Fitzgerald?" And we listened to Ella Fitzgerald on the way home, and she played at that beach. And so it was not only inspiring her about nature, but it was also inspiring her about the cultures that have evolved here in the Chesapeake, and how those things go together. The other thing that really I love about this place is the people. We talked about the Osprey Cam earlier. That was originally started by a family on the Eastern Shore on Kent Island, and they're still at their house. They're just such wonderful people, and they've been sharing those birds with people for 21 years now, 11 with us as an institution. And the people in the Chesapeake, their graciousness, their passion for our wildlife and our ecosystem, that's really inspiring too. To be able to share these beautiful creatures in this beautiful place with people is also really inspiring. The work that Explore.org does here, but also around the world, it's doing a huge service to inspire people to care about the planet. And I'm just so grateful to partner with you guys. I'm so grateful you picked up, our 3 cams and have been so supportive of our work, whether it's working, highlighting these beautiful species with people, or the support for our land conservation work. You guys have supported our work to reunite a tribe with land that they were forcibly removed from 350 years ago, which is just incredible. So, those stories, those people, and doing that for my daughters and sharing it with them, that's what it's all about for me.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And it's been great to talk with you today, Joel, about Chesapeake Bay. I want to thank you again for taking the time to be here with us and sharing your love of the Chesapeake region with us.
It's been my pleasure, and I'm very grateful to you guys for your partnership. So thanks.
Well, I want to thank my guest, Joel Dunne, the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy, for his time in sharing, like I said, his love and expertise about the Bay itself. The Chesapeake Conservancy is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation and restoration of the Chesapeake Bay watershed for the enjoyment and education and inspiration of this and future generations. So if you want to check out their work, a lot of great information on their website. You can find it at chesapeakeconservancy.org. And remember, Chesapeake has an E at the end of it. There were some questions that came in while we were listening to the interview with Joel. So let's try to get to those real quick before we conclude our broadcast today. Thanks to everyone who's been watching and listening and commenting. and asking questions. So first one that we have in our queue here, I think maybe one of the first questions that came up was, do ospreys like color? Do they search out colored objects to decorate their nests? And if you're wondering why, someone might ask this question when you're watching osprey nests, often you'll find things like rope, there's plastic in there. You'll find other, human-made objects in there, and they're often very colorful. And I don't know specifically, if they search out colored objects. But from what I've been reading about how they construct their nest, oftentimes it's sort of like in the later stages of nest building that they're looking for softer things. So things like grass, or maybe in the southeast United States, things like Spanish moss that are hanging from trees, and maybe some of those plastic objects that we discard in the environment, which we shouldn't do, is one of those things that an osprey looks at and is like, hey, that seems like maybe a soft object that I can put in my nest. It can often be harmful for them, though. Osprey chicks, adult ospreys, can get entangled in things like plastic rope. So it's another reason to reduce plastic pollution, reduce our consumption of plastic just in general, but also especially make sure that it's not going to the wrong places when we do have to dispose of it. So I don't know, again, if they search out colored objects or not. It might be, my best guess is maybe it's the texture of those objects. But you also see hard objects in there too, like like fishing buoys and things like that. So maybe my hypothesis is completely off the mark. I'm not exactly sure on that. But thanks for asking. And another question here about osprey and also about bald eagles. Somebody was wondering, why are osprey doing so well now, but it seems that bald eagles are not? Depends on where you're looking. In some places, eagle populations are large and they're very healthy, like in Alaska, different parts of Canada, and even in parts of the contiguous United States, bald eagle populations can be doing quite well. But again, it's sort of like a localized thing. So you want to, there's that old adage, like, think globally but act locally. And in some places, maybe the habitats aren't quite up to snuff for a full recovery for osprey, or excuse me, bald eagles. Maybe that's because of continued pollution. Maybe that has to do with habitat loss. Maybe that has to do with a lack of suitable nesting sites, things like that. So it varies widely from place to place. Osprey, for example, doing really, really well in the Chesapeake region, but it varies from place to place. We have cameras on bald eagles in the Channel Islands area of California, and a lot of those birds are still suffering from DDT contamination decades after that chemical is banned in the United States. So it varies considerably from place to place. Somebody was wondering about heron rookeries. Of course, we talked about that. In the interview with Joel, this person writes in, there's a heron rookery in my area. To whom should I report it? And I would try to look for your local, state wildlife agency, whatever agency might have the task of managing like bird habitat in your state, or waterfowl habitat in your state. That might be the best place to go. So there's state agencies. There's also the federal equivalent, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can also seek out your local, maybe birding clubs in the area, or maybe a national organization like the Audubon Society. If it's in the Chesapeake Bay region, then hey, I think you'd reach out directly to the Chesapeake Conservancy, and they can maybe tell you whether that's a known site or something that's new, because Joel did mention that they move around from year to year. Another question about heron rookeries. This person writes in, consistent use of a rookery area may eventually damage or even kill some trees. Do herons move their nests around much? From what I read, it doesn't seem like great blue herons have like fidelity to like a single nest in a rookery. So even though they might return to a nest, or excuse me, a rookery, it's really kind of like the rookery that they're returning to, not that particular nest itself. So maybe they'll look at it and they'll be like, this doesn't seem structurally sound. In their own way, they're sort of like figuring that out. And maybe they're going to move on to nest. But I also was just looking at some information that the fidelity is to like the rookery itself, and also the tree species within the rookery too. So like the rookery that we watch on explore.org, that's primarily in loblolly pine. So if there was like maybe an oak or a maple or something growing up within that habitat, maybe those birds are looking for the pines rather than the oaks. It can really vary from place to place. So yeah, they will move their nests within that rookery from perhaps year to years. Maybe they're not going back to that same nest. And how long do they live? I think this question came in when maybe we were talking about great blue herons. More than 20 years, they can live. So they are long-lived birds, along with our peregrine falcons and bald eagles as well. I think all of those birds have the opportunity or the potential to live, and the ospreys too, more than 20 years. So yeah, long-lived birds for all of the species that we've kind of been talking about this today. And about viewing heron nests, somebody wrote in and wondered, are there hiking trails where herons can be observed from a safe distance if visiting the area rookeries? Yeah, and from a safe distance, that's an important, I think, caveat. We want to avoid disturbing birds or disturbing wildlife in general, but especially during the breeding season. Those are very sensitive habitats. So when you're looking to observe a heron colony, maybe bring a pair of binoculars. That could be one of your best tools to have you there, so you can have an enjoyable experience and make sure that you're not disturbing the birds. There are places where those are publicly visible. I don't know of many sites. It depends on where you are. So again, seek out maybe your local birding clubs or like the Audubon Society or other conservation organizations in your area. They may know. If you're visiting Yellowstone National Park, I do know, at least when I worked there, and this is 10 years ago now, more than 10 years ago now, but near Mud Volcano, which was one of the more popular sort of like thermal areas in the park, there was an active heron rookery there. But again, that was about 10 years ago. They could have moved on to a different spot in the park. But if you're going to Yellowstone, maybe ask the rangers about that and see if they happen to know about it. But yes, there are definitely places where people can view heron rookeries. Another question about the herons and in their status after the great horned owl attack on the nest, and I touched on that at the top of the broadcast. And again, if you joined us a little bit late, we couldn't talk about it during the interview with Joel because I recorded that prior to the events that happened on May 22nd when a great horned owl came in and attacked the nest, killed a couple of chicks, and the third chick is now in a rehab center, hopefully making a steady recovery. But this person was wondering and writes in, I'm assuming it's too late for the herons to try for a second family. Are we likely to continue to see them at the nest? We know that they were visiting the nest like earlier today itself, and there was even a little bit of nestoration perhaps going on. At least I saw some screen captures from our sharp of like the herons moving, things like that. It's still not that late in the breeding season for them. Although I don't know whether they may renest or try again for a second clutch. It's possible because that does happen in other great blue heron populations. If they lose their first clutch early enough, maybe they'll try again. They might try at that nest, or maybe they're like, you know what, this weirds us out a little bit too much. Maybe we'll go on to a different nest, or maybe where it could be a little bit more secure. Again, I don't know. We're going to find out, though, at least with that nest specifically, by continuing to watch the cams over the next couple of weeks or so. And our final question that came in is about the conservation in Chesapeake Bay and those efforts. This person writes in and asks, have landowners been a harder sell, asking them to change certain practices or habits to enable conservation efforts? And that is also, dependent on the person. It's dependent on the relationship between the organization that's maybe trying to work with landowners. Sometimes it could be really easy if everyone's philosophy is aligned, but a lot of times it's not. And that could be due to longstanding historic conflicts or injustices, economic reasons. You can probably think of a variety of others. So it seems like it's much more effective for conservation organizations to work hand in hand with landowners instead of trying to come in and try to bludgeon them into doing things their way. That is not going to work. I think the future of conservation is working with people and allowing people to utilize landscapes in ways that maybe they had done historically. There's not enough room, I think, to wall off large contiguous areas of the world anymore, and especially that would be unjust for indigenous peoples that have used those lands for many thousands of years. So we have to think differently about how we're thinking of conservation going forward, especially in heavily populated areas like the Chesapeake Bay region. You could not protect the Chesapeake Bay without thinking almost first and foremost about how people are going to utilize the landscape now and into the future. But this was, great questions, everyone. Thanks for asking those. It was a great conversation with my guest, Joel Dunne from the Chesapeake Conservancy. We're going to be back online with more live chats in the future. So just one final word on Chesapeake Bay itself. It's, you heard Joel speak very eloquently about it. And I think, we can follow his lead and work to protect the Bay. If it's going to have the best opportunity to thrive, it's going to take a concerted effort to protect and ensure the health. Anything more than that. But my name is Mike Fitz with Explore.org. Thanks for joining us today. And until I talk to you again, never stop learning.